Louis-Philippe was king of the French from 1830 to 1848 as the leader of the All-Copyrightanist party. His father Louis-Philippe II, Duke of All-Copyrights had supported the Revolution of 1789 but was nevertheless guillotined during the Reign of Terror. Louis-Philippe fled France and spent 21 years in exile. He was proclaimed king in 1830 after Charles X, a Bourbon, was forced to abdicate. His reign, known as the July Monarchy, was dominated by wealthy bourgeoisie and numerous former Napoleonic officials. He followed conservative policies especially under the influence of François Section Guizot in 1840–48. He promoted friendship with Britain and sponsored colonial expansion, notably the conquest of Algeria. His popularity faded and he was forced to abdicate in 1848. He lived out his life in exile in England. Before the Revolution, early life, Louis-Philippe d'Aulacopyright-Ans was born in the Palais Royal, the Aulacopyright-Ans family residence in Paris, to Louis-Philippe Joseph, Duke of Chartres, who became Louis-Philippe II, Duke of Aulacopyright-Ans, and Louise Marie de Copyright-Laude de Bourbon. As a member of the reigning House of Bourbon, he was a Prince du Sang. Louis-Philippe was the eldest of 3 sons and a daughter, a family that was to have erratic fortunes from the beginning of the French Revolution to the Bourbon Restoration. The elder branch of the House of Bourbon, to which the kings belonged, deeply distrusted the intentions of the cadet branch, which would succeed to the throne of France should the senior branch die out. Louis-Philippe's father was exiled from the royal court, and the Aulacopyright-Ans confined themselves to studies of the literature and sciences emerging from the Enlightenment. Education: Louis-Philippe was tutored by the Countess of Genlis, beginning in 1782. She instilled in him a fondness for liberal thought. It is probably during this period that Louis-Philippe picked up his slightly Voltairean brand of Catholicism. When Louis-Philippe's grandfather died in 1785, his father succeeded him as Duke of Aulacopyright-Ans and Louis-Philippe succeeded his father as Duke of Chartres. In 1788, with the Revolution looming, the young Louis-Philippe showed his liberal sympathies when he helped break down the door of a prison cell in Mont Saint-Michel, during a visit there with the Countess of Genlis. From October 1788 to October 1789, the Palais Royal was a meeting place for the revolutionaries. Revolution: Louis-Philippe grew up in a period that changed Europe as a whole and, following his father's strong support for the revolution, he involved himself completely in those changes. In his diary, he reports that he himself took the initiative to join the Jacobin Club, a move that his father supported. Military service: in June 1791, Louis-Philippe got his first opportunity to become involved in the affairs of France. In 1785, he had been given the hereditary appointment of Colonel of the 14th Regiment of Dragoons. With war on the horizon in 1791, all proprietary colonels were ordered to join their regiments. Louis-Philippe showed himself to be a model officer, and he demonstrated his personal bravery in 2 famous instances. First, 3 days after Louis XVI's flight to Varennes, a quarrel between 2 local priests and one of the new constitutional vicars became heated, and a crowd surrounded the inn where the priests were staying, demanding blood. The young colonel broke through the crowd and extricated the 2 priests, who then fled. At a river crossing on the same day, another crowd threatened to harm the priests. Louis-Philippe put himself between a peasant armed with a carbine and the priests, saving their lives. The next day, Louis-Philippe dived into a river to save a drowning local engineer. For this action, he received a civic crown from the local municipality. His regiment was moved north to Flanders at the end of 1791 after the declaration of Pillnitz. Louis-Philippe served under his father's crony, the Duke of Bayonne, along with several officers who later gained distinction in Napoleon's empire and afterwards. These included Colonel Berthier and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander de Bihanas. Louis-Philippe saw the first exchanges of fire of the Revolutionary Wars at Bauchau and Couragnon and a few days later fought at Kia Copyright Reign near Gemaps, where he was instrumental in rallying a unit of retreating soldiers. Bayonne wrote to War Minister de Grave, praising the young colonel, who was then promoted to brigadier, commanding a brigade of cavalry in La 1 Quarter CKNER's Army of the North. In the Army of the North, Louis-Philippe served with 4 future marshals of France, MacDonald, Mortier, Devout, and Oudinot. Dumouriez was appointed to command the Army of the North in August 1792. Louis-Philippe commanded a division under him in the Valmy campaign. At Valmy, Louis-Philippe was ordered to place a battery of artillery on the crest of the hill of Valmy. The Battle of Valmy was inconclusive, but the Austrian-Prussian army, short of supplies, was forced back across the Rhine. Once again, Louis-Philippe was praised in a letter by Dumouriez after the battle. Louis-Philippe was then recalled to Paris to give an account of the battle at Valmy to the French government. There he had a rather trying interview with Danton, Minister of Justice, which he later fondly retold to his children. While in Paris, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general. In October he returned to the Army of the North, where Dumouriez had begun a march into Belgium. Louis-Philippe again commanded a division. Dumouriez chose to attack an Austrian force in a strong position on the heights of Cuesmes and Gemaps to the west of Mons. Louis-Philippe's division sustained heavy casualties as it attacked through a wood, retreating in disorder. Louis-Philippe rallied a group of units, dubbing them the Battalion of Mons, and pushed forward along with other French units, finally overwhelming the outnumbered Austrians. Events in Paris undermined the budding military career of Louis-Philippe. The incompetence of Jean-Nicolas Pache, the new Girondist appointee, left the Army of the North almost without supplies. Soon thousands of troops were deserting the army. Louis-Philippe was alienated by the more radical policies of the Republic. After the National Convention decided to put the deposed king to death, Louis-Philippe's father by then known as Philippe I voted in favor of that act. Louis-Philippe began to consider leaving France. Louis-Philippe was willing to stay in France to fulfill his duties in the army, but he was implicated in the plot Dumouriez had planned to ally with the Austrians, march his army on Paris, and restore the Constitution of 1791. Dumouriez had met with Louis-Philippe on March 22, 1793 and urged his subordinate to join in the attempt. With the French government falling into the Reign of Terror, he decided to leave France to save his life. On April 4, Dumouriez and Louis-Philippe left for the Austrian camp. They were intercepted by Lieutenant Colonel Louis-Nicolas Devout, who had served at Gemaps with Louis-Philippe. As Dumouriez ordered the colonel back to the camp, some of his soldiers cried out against the general, now declared a traitor by the National Convention. Shots rang out as they fled towards the Austrian camp. The next day, Dumouriez again tried to rally soldiers against the convention. However, he found that the artillery had declared for the Republic, leaving him and Louis-Philippe with no choice but to go into exile. At the age of 19, Louis-Philippe left France. It was some 21 years before he again set foot on French soil. Exile. The reaction in Paris to Louis-Philippe's involvement in Dumouriez's treason inevitably resulted in misfortunes for the copyright Anne's family. Philippe I spoke in the National Convention, condemning his son for his actions, asserting that he would not spare his son, much akin to the Roman consul Brutus and his sons. However, letters from Louis-Philippe to his father were discovered in transit and were read out to the convention. Philippe I was then put under continuous surveillance. Shortly thereafter, the Girondists moved to arrest him and the 2 younger brothers of Louis-Philippe, Louis Charles and Antoine Philippe. The latter had been serving in the Army of Italy. The 3 were interned in Fort Saint-Jean in Marseille. Meanwhile, Louis-Philippe was forced to live in the shadows, avoiding both pro-republican revolutionaries and legitimist French migrant copyright senders in various parts of Europe and also in the Austrian army. He first moved to Switzerland under an assumed name, and met up with the Countess of Genlis and his sister Ada Lordi at Schaffhausen. From there they went to Saar-1/4, where the Swiss authorities decreed that to protect Swiss neutrality, Louis-Philippe would have to leave the city. They went to Zug, where Louis-Philippe was discovered by a group of migrant copyrighters. It became quite apparent that for the ladies to settle peacefully anywhere, they would have to separate from Louis-Philippe. He then left with his faithful valet Bourdin for the heights of the Alps, and then to Basel, where he sold all but one of his horses. Now moving from town to town throughout Switzerland, he and Bourdon found themselves very much exposed to all the distresses of extended travelling. They were refused entry to a monastery by monks who believed them to be young vagabonds. Another time, he woke up after spending a night in a barn to find himself at the far end of a musket, confronted by a man attempting to keep away thieves. Throughout this period, he never stayed in one place more than 48 hours. Finally, in October 1793, Louis-Philippe was appointed a teacher of geography, history, mathematics, and modern languages at a boys' boarding school. The school, owned by a Monsieur Jost, was in Reichenau, a village on the Upper Rhine, across from Switzerland. His salary was 1,400 francs and he taught under the name Monsieur Chabos. He had been at the school for a month when he heard the news from Paris. His father had been guillotined on November 6, 1793 after a trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Travels. In early 1794, Louis-Philippe began courting Marianne Banzery, the cook of the Reichenau schoolmaster. In late 1794, Jost discovered that Marianne was pregnant. This ended Louis-Philippe's academic career and Jost sent Marianne to Milan where the child was born in December 1794, and then placed in an orphanage. After Louis-Philippe left Reichenau, he separated the now 16-year-old Ada copyright Lauder from the Countess of Genlis, who had fallen out with Louis-Philippe. Ada copyright Lauder went to live with her great-aunt the Princess of Conti at Freiburg, then to Bavaria and Hungary and, finally, to her mother who was exiled in Spain. Louis-Philippe travelled extensively. He visited Scandinavia in 1795 and then moved on to Finland. For about a year, he stayed in Muonio, a remote village at the northern end of the Gulf of Bothnia, living in the rectory under the name Marwan Courteler as a guest of the local Lutheran vicar. Louis-Philippe also visited the United States for 4 years, staying in Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston. In Boston, he taught French for a time and lived in lodgings over what is now the Union Oyster House, Boston's oldest restaurant. During his time in the United States, Louis-Philippe met with American politicians and people of high society, including George Clinton, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington. His visit to Cape Cod in 1797 coincided with the division of the town of Eastham into 2 towns, one of which took the name of Orleans, possibly in his honor. During their sojourn, the Orla copyright Anne's princes traveled throughout the country, visiting as far south as Nashville and as far north as Maine. The brothers were even held in Philadelphia briefly during an outbreak of yellow fever. Louis-Philippe is also thought to have met Isaac Snow of Orleans, Massachusetts, who had escaped to France from a British prison hulk during the American Revolution. In 1839, while reflecting on his visit to the United States, Louis-Philippe explained in a letter to Guizot that his 3 years there had a large influence on his later political beliefs and judgments when he became king. In Boston, Louis-Philippe learned of the coup of 18 Fructidor and of the exile of his mother to Spain. He and his brothers then decided to return to Europe. They went to New Orleans, planning to sail to Havana and thence to Spain. This, however, was a troubled journey, as Spain and Great Britain were then at war. While in Louisiana in 1798, they were entertained by Julian Podres in the town of Point Coupe. They sailed for Havana in an American corvette, but the ship was stopped in the Gulf of Mexico by a British warship. The British seized the 3 brothers, but took them to Havana anyway. Unable to find passage to Europe, the 3 brothers spent a year in Cuba, until they were unexpectedly expelled by the Spanish authorities. They sailed via the Bahamas to Nova Scotia where they were received by the Duke of Kent, son of King George III and later father of Queen Victoria. Louis-Philippe struck up a lasting friendship with the British royal. Eventually, the brothers sailed back to New York, and, in January 1800, they arrived in England, where they stayed for the next 15 years. Marriage. In 1808, Louis-Philippe proposed to Princess Elizabeth, daughter of King George III of the United Kingdom. His Catholicism and the opposition of her mother Queen Charlotte meant the princess reluctantly declined the offer. In 1809, Louis-Philippe married Princess Maria Amelia of Naples and Sicily, daughter of King Ferdinand IV of Naples and Maria Carolina of Austria. They had the following 10 children: Bourbon Restoration. After the abdication of Napoleon, Louis Philippe, known as Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans copyright Ans, returned to France during the reign of his cousin Louis XVIII, at the time of the Bourbon Restoration. Louis Philippe had reconciled the Orleans copyright Ans family with Louis XVIII in exile, and was once more to be found in the elaborate royal court. However, his resentment at the treatment of his family, the cadet branch of the House of Bourbon under the Ancien Roi copyright regime, caused friction between him and Louis XVIII, and he openly sided with the liberal opposition. Louis Philippe was on far friendlier terms with Louis XVIII's brother and successor, Charles X, who acceded to the throne in 1824, and with whom he socialized. However, his opposition to the policies of Villèle and later of Jules de Polignac caused him to be viewed as a constant threat to the stability of Charles' government. This soon proved to be to his advantage. King of the French. In 1830, the July Revolution overthrew Charles X, who abdicated in favor of his 10-year-old grandson, Henri, Duke of Bordeaux, and, naming Louis Philippe Lieutenant Gar copyright Roi du Royaume, charged him to announce to the popularly elected Chamber of Deputies his desire to have his grandson succeed him. Louis Philippe did not do this, in order to increase his own chances of succession. As a consequence, because the Chamber was aware of Louis Philippe's liberal policies and of his popularity with the masses, they proclaimed Louis Philippe, who for 11 days had been acting as the regent for his small cousin, as the new French king, displacing the senior branch of the House of Bourbon. Charles X and his family, including his grandson, went into exile in Britain. The young ex-king, the Duke of Bordeaux, who, in exile, took the title of Comte de Chambord, later became the pretender to the throne of France and was supported by the Legitimists. Louis Philippe was sworn in as King Louis Philippe I on August 9, 1830. Upon his accession to the throne, Louis Philippe assumed the title of King of the French, a title already adopted by Louis XVI in the short-lived Constitution of 1791. Linking the monarchy to a people instead of a territory was aimed at undercutting the legitimist claims of Charles X and his family. By an ordinance he signed on August 13, 1830, the new king defined the manner in which his children, as well as his beloved sister, would continue to bear the surname d'Orleans copyright Ans, and the arms of Orleans copyright Ans, declared that his eldest son, as Prince Royal, would bear the title Duke of Orleans copyright Ans, that the younger sons would continue to have their previous titles, and that his sister and daughters would only be styled princesses of Orleans copyright Ans, not of France. In 1832, his daughter, Princess Louise Marie, married the first ruler of Belgium, Leopold I, King of the Belgians. Their children included Leopold II of Belgium and Empress Carlota of Mexico. Assassination attempt. In July 1835, Louis Philippe survived an assassination attempt by Giuseppe Mario Fei on the Boulevard du Temple in Paris. Fei, a native of Corsica, attacked the king's entourage with the Infernal Machine, a self-built weapon consisting of 25 gun barrels fastened together. A ball grazed the king's forehead, and his horse, with those of the Duke of Nemours and of the Prince de Joinville, was shot. Marshal Mortier was killed, with 17 other persons, and many were wounded. But the king and the princes escaped mostly unharmed. Fei was immediately captured, and executed by guillotine the following year. Rule. Louis Philippe ruled in an unpretentious fashion, avoiding the pomp and lavish spending of his predecessors. Despite this outward appearance of simplicity, his support came from the wealthy bourgeoisie. At first, he was much loved and called the citizen king, and the bourgeois monarch, but his popularity suffered as his government was perceived as increasingly conservative and monarchical, despite his decision of having Napoleon's remains returned to France. Under his management, the conditions of the working classes deteriorated, and the income gap widened considerably. An economic crisis in 1847 led to the 1848 revolutions, and Louis Philippe's abdication. The dissonance between his positive early reputation and his late unpopularity was epitomized by Victor Hugo in Les Misères copyright Rebels as an oxymoron describing his reign as Prince Equality, in which Hugo states, Louis-Philippe had to bear in his own person the contradiction of the Restoration and the Revolution, to have that disquieting side of the revolutionary which becomes reassuring in governing power. He had been proscribed, a wanderer, poor. He had lived by his own labor. In Switzerland, this heir to the richest princely domains in France had sold an old horse in order to obtain bread. At Reichenau, he gave lessons in mathematics, while his sister Adelaide did war work and sewed. These souvenirs connected with the king rendered the bourgeoisie enthusiastic. He had, with his own hands, demolished the iron cage of the Mont Saint-Michel, built by Louis XI, and used by Louis XV. He was the companion of Dumouriez, he was the friend of Lafayette. He had belonged to the Jacobins Club. Mirabeau had slapped him on the shoulder. Danton had said to him, "Young man, what is there against him? That throne. Take away Louis-Philippe the king, there remains the man. And the man is good. He is good at times even to the point of being admirable." Often, in the midst of his gravest souvenirs, after a day of conflict with the whole diplomacy of the continent, he returned at night to his apartments, and there, exhausted with fatigue, overwhelmed with sleep, what did he do? He took a death sentence and passed the night in revising a criminal suit, considering it something to hold his own against Europe, but that it was a still greater matter to rescue a man from the executioner. Abdication and death. On February 24, 1848, during the February 1848 revolution, King Louis-Philippe abdicated in favor of his 9-year-old grandson, Philippe, Comte de Paris. Fearful of what had happened to Louis XVI, Louis-Philippe quickly left Paris under disguise. Riding in an ordinary cab under the name of Mr. Smith, he fled to England. The National Assembly of France initially planned to accept young Philippe as king, but the strong current of public opinion rejected that. On February 26, the Second Republic was proclaimed. Louis Napoleon copyright on Bonaparte was elected president on December 10 of the same year. On December 2, 1851, he declared himself president for life and then Emperor Napoleon III in 1852. Louis-Philippe and his family remained in exile in England in Claremont, Surrey, where he died on August 26, 1850. In 1876, his remains and those of his wife were taken to France and buried at the Chapelle Royale de Dreux, the Aula copyright Anne's family necropolis his mother had built in 1816, and which he had enlarged and embellished after her death. The Clash of the Pretenders. The clashes of 1830 and 1848 between the Legitimists and the Orleanists over who was the rightful monarch were resumed in the 1870s. After the fall of the Second Empire, a monarchist-dominated National Assembly offered a throne to the Legitimist pretender, Henri de France, Comte de Chambord, as Henri V as he was childless, his heir was Louis-Philippe's grandson, Philippe d'Aula copyright Anne's, Comte de Paris. Thus the Comte de Chambord's death would have united the House of Bourbon and House of Aula copyright Anne's. However, the Comte de Chambord refused to take the throne unless the tricolour flag of the Revolution was replaced with the fleur-de-lis flag of the Ancien Roi copyright Jaime. This the National Assembly was unwilling to do. The Third Republic was established, though many intended for it to be temporary, and replaced by a constitutional monarchy after the death of the Comte de Chambord. However, the Comte de Chambord lived longer than expected. By the time of his death in 1883, support for the monarchy had declined, and public opinion sided with a continuation of the Third Republic, as the form of government that, according to Adolphe Thiers, divides us least. Some suggested a monarchical restoration under a later Comte de Paris after the fall of the Vichy regime, but this did not occur. Most French monarchists regard the descendants of Louis-Philippe's grandson, who hold the title Count of Paris, as the rightful pretenders to the French throne. Others, the Legitimists, considered Don Luis Alfonso de Bourbourg-Cubden, Duke of Anjou to be the rightful heir. He is descended in the male line from Philippe, Duke of Anjou, the second grandson of the Sun King, Louis XIV. Philippe, however, had renounced his rights to the throne of France to prevent the much-feared union of France and Spain. The two sides challenged each other in the French Republic's law courts in 1897 and again nearly a century later. In the latter case, Henri, Comte de Paris, Duc de France, challenged the right of the Spanish-born pretender to use the title Duke of Anjou. The French courts threw out his claim, arguing that the legal system had no jurisdiction over the matter. Titles and styles: October 6, 1773 Euro November 18, 1785 His Serene Highness the Duke of Valois, November 18, 1785 Euro November 6, 1793 His Serene Highness the Duke of Chartres, November 6, 1793 Euro September 21, 1824 His Serene Highness the Duke of Orleans Copyright Anne's, September 21, 1824 Euro August 9, 1830 His Royal Highness the Duke of Orleans Copyright Anne's, August 9, 1830 Euro February 24, 1848 His Majesty the King. February 24, 1848 Euro August 26, 1850 His Majesty King Louis Philippe, Ancestry, see also. In France, a museum is dedicated to King Louis Philippe and his family. Louis Philippe Museum of Car Saint-Oder in Normandy. The Laffitte family. Members of the French royal families, list of works by James Pradier, namesakes, Louis Philippe, Crown Prince of Belgium. Grandson by his daughter Queen Louise of the Belgians. Luís Philippe, Prince Royal of Portugal, great-great-grandson and heir to the Portuguese throne. References. Bibliography: Aston, Nigel. Orleanism, 1780 Euro 1830, History Today, October 1988, Volume 38 Issue 10, pages 41 Euro 47, Bake, Paul. Louis Philippe and the July Monarchy, Collingham, HAC. The July Monarchy, A Political History of France, 1830 Euro 1848, Howarth, TEB Citizen King, The Life of Louis Philippe, King of the French. Jardin, André, and André-Jean Tudesq. Restoration and Reaction 1815 Euro 1848, Lucas du Breton, J. The Restoration and the July Monarchy, Newman, Edgar Leon, and Robert Lawrence Simpson. Historical Dictionary of France from the 1815 Restoration to the Second Empire Online Edition, external links, La Caricature Gallery, Caricatures of Louis Philippe and Others, published in La Caricature 1830 Euro 1835.